The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The 28-year-old soldier from small-town Ohio had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He was representing the United States Army at a special ceremony, honoring fallen soldiers from both nations, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Marcus had been selected for this honor, not just because of his exemplary service record, but because of something more personal. His grandfather, William Thompson, had fought alongside British forces during World War II. The old man had passed away just 6 months earlier, and Marcus carried with him a faded photograph and a letter that his grandfather had written but never sent to a British soldier who had saved his life in Normandy. As Marcus walked through the palace gates, he couldn't help but think about the stories his grandfather used to tell. Tales of courage, brotherhood, and the bonds formed between soldiers regardless of their nationality. The elderly man had always spoken with deep respect about the British forces he had served with, describing them as disciplined, honorable, and unwavering in their duty. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in an hour, but Marcus had arrived early. He wanted to see the famous changing of the guard, something his grandfather had described in vivid detail from his brief visit to London after the war. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, excited chatter filling the air. But Marcus stood apart from the crowd, his military bearing evident even in the civilian setting. He watched as the Queen's Guard took their positions. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers, Marcus knew. Many of them were combat veterans, just like him. They had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts around the world. Yet here they stood perfectly still, their red tunics and bearskin hats making them look like something from another era. Marcus studied their faces, noting the discipline it took to remain motionless despite the crowd of tourists taking photos, the children pointing and laughing, and the occasional person who got too close. He recognized that kind of control. It was the same discipline that had kept him and his fellow soldiers alive during firefights in the mountains of Afghanistan. One guard in particular caught his attention. The young man couldn't have been more than 22, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to look right through the crowd. There was something in his expression that Marcus recognized, a certain weariness that came with having seen too much too young. It was a look Marcus had seen in mirrors after particularly difficult missions. As the ceremony began, Marcus found himself drawn into the precision of the movements. Every step was calculated, every motion deliberate. The guards moved as one unit, their synchronization perfect despite the distractions around them. Tourists pushed forward, trying to get better photos, but the guards never wavered. Then something unexpected happened. A small child, no more than 5 years old, broke away from his parents and ran directly toward one of the guards. The boy tripped on the uneven cobblestones and fell hard, scraping his knee and beginning to cry. His parents rushed forward, apologizing profusely, but they were too far away to reach him quickly. Marcus watched as the guard the child had run toward faced a dilemma. Protocol demanded that he remain perfectly still, but here was a hurt child crying at his feet. The crowd held its breath, cameras still rolling, waiting to see what would happen. For just a moment, Marcus saw something flicker in the guard's eyes. It was the same internal struggle he had faced countless times in Afghanistan when protocols clashed with human compassion. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained statue still. Even as the child's cries grew louder, Marcus felt his own chest tighten. He understood the guard's position completely. Duty versus compassion, rules versus humanity. It was a conflict that every soldier faced at some point. But watching this young guard struggle with it in such a public setting stirred something deep in Marcus's chest. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Marcus began to move forward. His grandfather's stories echoed in his mind, tales of soldiers helping soldiers, of brotherhood that transcended nationality and protocol. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, his military bearing causing people to step aside instinctively. The guard's eyes shifted slightly, just enough to register Marcus's approach. For a split second, their gazes met, and Marcus saw a flash of recognition, not of him personally, but of what he represented. Here was another soldier, someone who understood the weight of duty and the pull of compassion. Marcus knelt beside the crying child, his movements careful and deliberate. He didn't want to cause any disruption to the ceremony or put the guard in a more difficult position. Speaking softly, he comforted the boy while checking his scraped knee. The child's parents finally reached them, thanking Marcus profusely for his help. As Marcus stood up, he looked once more at the guard. The young man's eyes held a different expression now, something that looked almost like gratitude. The moment lasted only seconds, but Marcus felt a connection that transcended words, uniforms, and protocols. The ceremony continued around them, but something had changed. The interaction had been subtle, almost invisible to most of the crowd, but Marcus knew that both he and the guard had experienced something significant. It was a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the protocols, they were all human beings first. As Marcus made his way toward the palace entrance for his own ceremony, he thought about his grandfather's stories once more. The old man had always said that the strongest bonds between soldiers weren't forged through words, but through moments of understanding, small acts of recognition that acknowledged their shared burdens and responsibilities. Looking back one last time at the guards, Marcus felt a sense of continuity, as if he was part of a long line of soldiers who had found ways to connect across boundaries of nationality and protocol. The real test of these guards' resolve wasn't in their ability to remain motionless in the face of tourist cameras, but in their capacity to balance duty with humanity, tradition with compassion. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the ancient stones of the palace. Marcus straightened his shoulders and walked through the entrance, carrying with him not just his grandfather's letter, but a new understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor. Inside the palace, Marcus was guided through ornate corridors lined with portraits of monarchs and military heroes. The ceremony he was attending was more intimate than he had expected, with only about 50 attendees representing various military units from both the United States and the United Kingdom. The room itself was magnificent, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with battle flags from centuries of conflicts. As Marcus took his assigned seat, he noticed several British officers who wore the same bearing he had observed in the guards outside. There was a particular way they held themselves, a quiet confidence that spoke of long tradition and unwavering standards. He wondered how many of them had stood guard at this very palace, maintaining their vigil through rain and snow, tourist season, and quiet winter days. The ceremony began with remarks from a British general who spoke about the historical alliance between the two nations. Marcus listened intently as the general described joint operations, shared sacrifices, and the bonds forged in the heat of battle. The words resonated deeply with him, reminding him of his own experiences working alongside British forces in Afghanistan. When it came time for Marcus to present his grandfather's letter, he approached the podium with measured steps. The audience fell silent as he began to speak about William Thompson, a young soldier from Ohio who had found himself fighting alongside the Coldstream Guards in the push toward Berlin. Marcus's voice was steady, but emotion flickered in his eyes as he read portions of the letter his grandfather had written but never sent. The letter spoke of a moment during the Battle of the Bulge, when Marcus's grandfather had been separated from his unit and found himself behind enemy lines. A British soldier, Corporal James Mitchell of the Coldstream Guards, had risked his own life to guide the lost American back to safety. The two men had spent 3 days moving through enemy territory, sharing their rations and watching each other's backs. Marcus explained that his grandfather had always intended to find Corporal Mitchell after the war, to thank him properly, and to maintain the friendship they had begun. But life had intervened, families had been raised, and the letter had remained unfinished in a drawer for nearly 80 years. When his grandfather passed away, Marcus had found the letter along with a faded photograph of the two young soldiers standing together near a damaged church in France. As Marcus finished reading, he looked out at the audience and saw something remarkable. Several of the British officers were leaning forward, their attention completely focused on his words. One elderly gentleman in the front row had tears in his eyes. After the ceremony, this man approached Marcus and introduced himself as Colonel James Mitchell, retired. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as the elderly officer explained that his father had been Corporal James Mitchell of the Coldstream Guards. the same soldier who had helped Marcus's grandfather all those years ago. The colonel had grown up hearing stories about an American soldier his father had helped during the war, a young man from Ohio with a quick smile and an unshakable determination to get back to his unit. The two men stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the extraordinary nature of this connection. Colonel Mitchell explained that his father had passed away 5 years earlier, but had often wondered what had become of the American soldier he had helped. The colonel had even tried to locate him through military records, but with only a first name and a general description, the search had been impossible. Marcus carefully pulled out the faded photograph his grandfather had carried for decades. In it, two young soldiers stood side by side, their uniforms dirty and worn, but their faces bright with the relief of having survived another day. Colonel Mitchell studied the photo intently, then reached into his own jacket and produced a remarkably similar photograph. It was the same moment, taken from a slightly different angle, showing the same two soldiers in front of the same damaged church. The reunion of these photographs, carried by two families for nearly 8 decades, seemed to bridge not just time, but the very essence of military brotherhood. Other attendees gathered around, drawn by the emotion of the moment. Stories began to flow as veterans shared their own experiences of unexpected connections and lasting friendships forged in the crucible of conflict. Colonel Mitchell invited Marcus to his home the following day, promising to share more stories about his father's war experiences and to introduce him to other veterans who had served with the Coldstream Guards. Marcus accepted gratefully, feeling as though his grandfather's spirit was somehow present, finally completing a mission that had remained unfinished for so long. As the formal ceremony concluded, Marcus found himself in deep conversation with several British officers about modern military cooperation. They discussed joint training exercises, shared deployments, and the ways in which their respective forces had evolved while maintaining their core traditions. The conversation was both professional and personal, touching on the challenges of modern warfare and the importance of maintaining military traditions in an ever-changing world. One young captain, recently returned from Afghanistan, described his own experiences working with American forces. He spoke with evident respect about the professionalism and dedication he had witnessed, echoing the same sentiments that Marcus's grandfather had expressed about British soldiers decades earlier. It became clear that the bonds described in that 80-year-old letter were not relics of the past, but living connections that continued to strengthen with each shared mission and joint operation. As Marcus prepared to leave the palace, he reflected on the day's events. What had begun as a ceremonial duty had transformed into something far more significant. The connection with Colonel Mitchell felt like a gift from his grandfather, a final piece of unfinished business that had somehow found its way to completion. Walking back through the palace corridors, Marcus passed portraits of military leaders from both nations who had shaped history through their courage and collaboration. He thought about the guards still standing at their posts outside, maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries, while serving in a modern military force that operated around the globe. The young guard he had observed that morning came to mind again. Marcus wondered about his story, his experiences, and the weight of duty he carried. Tomorrow he would return to observe the changing of the guard once more, but this time with a deeper understanding of the traditions and the men who upheld them. As he stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, Marcus felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself. His grandfather's letter had been delivered, not to its original intended recipient, but to someone who could truly understand its significance. The circle had been completed in a way that felt both remarkable and somehow inevitable. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to emphasize the solemnity of the guard duty outside Buckingham Palace. Marcus returned as planned, but this time he wasn't just a tourist or ceremony participant. Colonel Mitchell had arranged for him to have a brief, informal meeting with the captain of the Queen's Guard, an opportunity that few civilians ever received. Captain Elizabeth Hartwell greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and the kind of direct gaze that spoke of someone accustomed to command. At 32, she was one of the youngest officers to hold this prestigious position, having earned it through exemplary service in multiple deployments and an unwavering commitment to the traditions of the Guards. Division. She led Marcus to a small office overlooking the parade ground where they could observe the guards preparing for their duties. Through the window, Marcus watched the same young guard from the previous day going through equipment checks with meticulous precision. Every button was polished, every piece of kit in perfect order. Captain Hartwell noticed Marcus's attention and smiled slightly. "That's Guardsman Davies," she said. "He's one of our finest. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the ceremonial unit. The transition from combat operations to ceremonial duties isn't easy for any of them." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. He had seen many soldiers struggle with the shift from active combat to peacetime duties, where the adrenaline of survival was replaced by the different but equally demanding pressure of representing something larger than oneself. The discipline required is different but no less intense, Captain Hartwell continued. In combat, you react to threats and changing situations. Here, the challenge is maintaining absolute composure regardless of what happens around you. Weather, crowds, personal discomfort, unexpected events. None of it can affect your bearing. She explained that many people misunderstood the role of the Queen's Guard, viewing it as merely ceremonial. In reality, these were active soldiers who rotated between ceremonial duties and operational deployments. The skills required for guard duty, discipline, attention to detail, ability to remain calm under pressure, were the same qualities that made them effective in combat situations. Marcus asked about the incident with the child the previous day, and Captain Hartwell's expression became more serious. "Guardsman Davies handled that perfectly," she said. "The protocol is clear. Maintain position regardless of circumstances. But I also know it was difficult for him. He has a younger brother about that child's age back home in Wales," she continued. "What you did yesterday was exactly right. You helped without creating a diplomatic incident or forcing our guardsmen to break protocol. It showed understanding of military culture and respect for our traditions, while still responding to a human need." Through the window, they watched as Guardsman Davies and his fellow guards began their march to the sentry boxes. Their movements were synchronized with mechanical precision, yet Marcus could see the individual personalities beneath the identical uniforms. One guard had a slight favoring of his left leg, suggesting an old injury. Another had eyes that constantly scanned the crowd, habits formed from months of watching for threats in hostile territory. Captain Hartwell shared more about the challenges her guards faced. The physical demands were obvious, standing motionless for hours in all weather conditions while wearing heavy woolen uniforms and carrying ceremonial weapons. But the mental challenges were equally significant. Tourists often tried to provoke reactions, sometimes behaving inappropriately or disrespectfully. The guards had to maintain their composure while remaining alert for genuine security threats. "People assume they can say or do anything because we won't react," she explained. "But every guardsman is a trained soldier, fully capable of responding to real threats. The trick is distinguishing between someone being silly with a camera and someone who might pose an actual danger." Marcus learned that the guards underwent extensive psychological preparation for their ceremonial role. They practiced meditation techniques to help maintain focus during long periods of motionlessness. They studied crowd psychology to better understand the behavior they would encounter. Most importantly, they learned to find personal meaning in their duty that went beyond the external pressures and distractions. As they watched, a group of tourists began gathering around Guardsman Davies's position. Marcus observed the familiar pattern, photos from a respectful distance gradually becoming more intrusive. Someone would inevitably try to get the guard to react, to smile, or acknowledge their presence. It was a test that played out dozens of times each day. One tourist, a middle-aged man with the expensive camera, began positioning himself closer and closer to the guard. He was clearly trying to get a dramatic close-up shot, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned about personal space and protocol. The guard remained perfectly still, but Marcus could see the slight tension in his jaw. Captain Hartwell noticed it too. "Davies is still learning to block out the distractions," she said quietly. "He's excellent at the technical aspects of guard duty, but the psychological component takes time to master. Some of our most experienced guards can almost enter a meditative state, becoming completely unaware of the crowds around them." The situation with the persistent tourist was escalating. Other visitors were starting to take notice, some even encouraging the man to get closer for his shot. Marcus felt his own tension rising, remembering times when civilian behavior had complicated military operations. There was a fine line between respectful observation and interference with duty. Captain Hartwell was already moving toward the door. "I should go address this before it becomes a real problem," she said. But before she could step outside, something unexpected happened. An elderly gentleman, distinguished and well-dressed, approached the intrusive tourist and spoke to him quietly. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but the man's body language was unmistakably authoritative. The tourist looked confused for a moment, then sheepish, and quickly stepped back to a more appropriate distance. "Colonel Mitchell," Captain Hartwell said with a smile. "Right on time." Marcus realized that the elderly officer he had met the previous day had arrived for their planned meeting. Colonel Mitchell approached the window and gave a small wave before heading toward the entrance. When he joined them in the office, Colonel Mitchell explained what he had told the tourist. "I simply mentioned that the young man was a combat veteran deserving of respect, and that his duty required complete focus. Sometimes people just need context to understand appropriate behavior." The three military officers spent the next hour discussing the intersection of tradition and modern service. Colonel Mitchell shared stories from his own time as a young guardsman, describing the evolution of the role over decades of social and political change. The core requirements remained the same, but the environment in which the guards operated had become increasingly complex. Marcus began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just military tradition, but a living example of how service members adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining essential standards. The guards outside weren't museum pieces or tourist attractions, but active soldiers performing a duty that connected them to centuries of military heritage while preparing them for contemporary challenges. Later that afternoon, Colonel Mitchell invited Marcus to visit the Guards Museum, a private tour that would provide deeper insight into the history and traditions of the regiments responsible for protecting the monarchy. The museum was quieter than the palace grounds, with fewer tourists and a more reflective atmosphere that allowed for serious conversation about military service and tradition. As they walked through exhibits displaying uniforms, weapons, and artifacts from centuries of conflicts, Colonel Mitchell shared personal stories that brought the displays to life. He showed Marcus a medal case containing decorations earned by members of his father's unit during World War II, including a military cross awarded to Corporal James Mitchell for the action that had saved Marcus's grandfather. "My father never spoke much about receiving this medal," Colonel Mitchell explained, pointing to the silver cross with its distinctive ribbon. "He always said he was just doing his job, helping a fellow soldier who needed assistance." But the citation tells a different story. 3 days behind enemy lines, navigating through German patrols, sharing his rations with a wounded American, while they both made their way back to Allied positions. Marcus studied the medal and the faded citation that accompanied it. The formal military language couldn't capture the fear, exhaustion, and determination that his grandfather and Corporal Mitchell must have experienced during those 3 days. But it provided official recognition of an act of courage that had rippled through two families for 8 decades. They continued through the museum, pausing at displays that showed the evolution of the Guards' role from battlefield formations to their modern dual function as both ceremonial troops and active military units. Colonel Mitchell explained how the traditions that tourists observed outside Buckingham Palace had their roots in actual combat procedures, movements and protocols that had been refined through centuries of warfare. "The precision you see in the changing of the guard isn't just for show," he said, stopping before a display of historical battle formations. "These movements were once used to coordinate large units under fire. The discipline required to execute them perfectly in combat translated naturally to ceremonial duties. In many ways, every ceremony is a demonstration of combat readiness." As they discussed this connection between tradition and practicality, Marcus began to understand why his encounter with Guardsman Davies the previous day had felt so significant. The young guard's internal struggle between protocol and compassion wasn't just a ceremonial dilemma, it was the same type of decision-making process that soldiers faced in combat situations every day. Colonel Mitchell introduced Marcus to the museum's curator, a retired Guards officer named Major Thompson, who had served in the Falklands War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Major Thompson was particularly interested in Marcus's observations about the similarities between British and American military culture, especially the shared emphasis on discipline, honor, and mutual support among service members. What many civilians don't understand, Major Thompson explained, is that military traditions aren't arbitrary rules or empty rituals. They're time-tested methods for building the kind of character and unit cohesion that saves lives in combat. The tourist who sees a guardsman standing motionless for 2 hours is witnessing the visible result of training that could make the difference between life and death in a firefight. The conversation turned to modern military cooperation between British and American forces. All three men had experience working in joint operations, and they found common ground in their respect for professional soldiers, regardless of nationality. Marcus shared stories from Afghanistan about British troops he had worked with, describing their professionalism and dry humor even in dangerous situations. Major Thompson pulled out a photo album containing pictures from recent joint training exercises. The images showed British and American soldiers working together on everything from marksmanship training to complex tactical scenarios. In many of the photos, it was difficult to distinguish between the nationalities. The gear might be slightly different, but the bearing and professionalism were identical. "This is the real legacy of what your grandfather and my father experienced," Colonel Mitchell said, pointing to a photo of mixed British and American units conducting a training exercise. Not just the specific friendships they formed, but the foundation they helped build for ongoing cooperation between our forces. As closing time approached, Major Thompson offered to show Marcus one final exhibit that wasn't normally accessible to the public. He led them to a small room containing personal items donated by families of guards who had served in recent conflicts. Unlike the formal displays in the main museum, this collection felt intimate and immediate. There were letters home, photographs from deployments, personal gear that had been carried through multiple tours. One display case contained items from Guardsman Davies, the young soldier Marcus had observed. His combat gear from Afghanistan was arranged alongside his ceremonial uniform components, illustrating the dual nature of his service. Marcus read the brief biography that accompanied the display. Guardsman Davies had joined the Welsh Guards at 18, deployed to Afghanistan twice before his 21st birthday, and earned commendations for his performance under fire. The young man who had stood so perfectly still while a child cried, at his feet had previously spent months scanning rooftops for snipers and watching for improvised explosive devices along convoy routes. "This helps explain his reaction yesterday," Marcus said quietly. "The discipline to maintain position despite emotional pressure isn't just ceremonial training. It's a survival skill he developed in combat." Colonel Mitchell nodded. "Every guard you see has a similar story. Some are fresh from basic training, but many are combat veterans transitioning between deployments. The ceremonial role gives them time to decompress from combat operations while maintaining their military skills and discipline." As they prepared to leave the museum, Major Thompson presented Marcus with a small gift, a regimental badge from the Coldstream Guards, the same unit his grandfather had served alongside. It was a gesture of respect and recognition, acknowledging the connection that had brought them together and the ongoing bond between their military traditions. Walking back through London in the early evening, Marcus reflected on everything he had learned over the past 2 days. What had started as a simple ceremonial duty had evolved into a profound exploration of military heritage, international cooperation, and the personal connections that sustained both. The city around them was bustling with evening commuters and tourists, people going about their daily lives largely unaware of the traditions and sacrifices that provided the foundation for their security. Marcus thought about Guardsman Davies, probably finishing his duty shift and preparing for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring, whether ceremonial, training, or potentially another deployment to a combat zone. Colonel Mitchell seemed to be following a similar line of thought. "The remarkable thing about military service," he said as they paused at a busy intersection, "is how it connects us across time and distance. Your grandfather and my father, you and Guardsman Davies, all the soldiers we've served with over the years, we're all part of something larger than ourselves." As they parted ways at the underground station, Colonel Mitchell invited Marcus to maintain contact, suggesting that their friendship could honor the connection their predecessors had never been able to complete. Marcus accepted gratefully, feeling that his time in London had accomplished far more than he had expected when he first arrived to deliver his grandfather's letter. On his final morning in London, Marcus made one last visit to Buckingham Palace. This time, however, he had a specific purpose beyond observation. Captain Hartwell had arranged for him to briefly meet Guardsman Davies during a break between duties, an unusual privilege that reflected the respect he had earned through his conduct and military bearing. The meeting took place in a small anteroom within the palace complex, away from the crowds and cameras that defined the guards' usual working environment. When Guardsman Davies entered, Marcus was struck by how young he looked without the imposing bearskin hat and the formal distance of ceremonial duty. At 23, he had the same earnest expression that Marcus remembered from his own early military service. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for yesterday," Davies said immediately, his Welsh accent giving warmth to his formal words. "What you did with that child, it meant more than you might realize." Marcus waved off the thanks, but Davies continued. "You see, sir, my youngest brother Callum is about that age. He was born while I was on my first deployment in Afghanistan. When I came home, he was afraid of me at first. I was just this stranger in uniform. It took months before he would let me get close to him." The young guardsman explained that one of the most difficult aspects of his service was missing important moments in his family's life. Between deployments and ceremonial duties, he was often away from Wales for months at a time. His younger siblings were growing up with only brief glimpses of their brother, and he worried about the effect his absence was having on them. "When that little boy fell yesterday, all I could think about was Callum," Davies admitted. "I wanted to help, but I couldn't break position. I've been trained to compartmentalize, to separate personal feelings from duty, but sometimes it's harder than others." Marcus found himself sharing his own experiences with the conflict between military duty and personal emotions. He told Davies about times in Afghanistan when he had to make difficult choices, when following orders meant setting aside personal feelings or when helping others required accepting significant risk. "The key," Marcus said, "is understanding that discipline doesn't mean becoming emotionless. It means learning to channel your emotions in ways that serve your mission and your fellow soldiers. What you felt yesterday shows that you're still human, still connected to the people you're sworn to protect." Davies nodded thoughtfully. "My sergeant said something similar after my first combat deployment. He told me that the soldiers who worried him were the ones who stopped feeling anything, not the ones who struggled with feeling too much." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Hartwell, who had come to escort Davies back to his duties. But she lingered for a moment, observing the interaction between the American soldier and her guardsman with evident approval. "This is exactly what military exchange should accomplish," she said. "Not just formal ceremonies and official meetings, but genuine connections between people who understand the challenges and rewards of service." As Davies prepared to return to his post, he made an unexpected request. "Sir, I know this might be irregular, but would you be willing to write a letter to my family? My parents and siblings don't always understand what military service means, especially the ceremonial aspects. They see the uniforms and the parades on television, but they don't really understand why it matters or how it connects to what I did in Afghanistan." Marcus was touched by the request and immediately agreed. He understood the challenge of helping civilian family members comprehend military culture and the importance of traditions that might seem archaic or unnecessary to outsiders. After Davies returned to his duties, Marcus spent time with Captain Hartwell discussing the broader challenges facing modern military forces. She explained that recruitment and retention were ongoing concerns, particularly among young people who had grown up with little direct connection to military life or understanding of military values. "Guardsman Davies represents our ideal," she said. "Combat experience, dedication to tradition, and genuine care for others. But finding and developing soldiers like him becomes more difficult when fewer families have military connections, and when popular culture often portrays military service negatively or unrealistically," she continued. "Programs like the ceremony you participated in help bridge that gap. When civilians see that military service produces people like you, thoughtful, articulate, committed to something larger than themselves, it helps them understand why these traditions matter." Marcus asked about the long-term future of ceremonial duties in an era of budget constraints and changing social attitudes. Captain Hartwell acknowledged that there were ongoing debates about the resources devoted to ceremonial functions, but she argued that these duties served important purposes beyond tourism and tradition. Every ceremony is a recruitment opportunity, she explained. Young people see the precision, the pride, the sense of belonging, and some of them want to be part of it. The discipline required for ceremonial duties also translates directly to operational effectiveness. Units that excel at drill and ceremony consistently perform better in combat situations. As Marcus prepared to leave for his flight back to the United States, he reflected on the unexpected depth of his London experience. What had begun as a simple duty to honor his grandfather's memory had evolved into a complex exploration of military culture, international cooperation, and personal connection. He thought about the letter he would write to Davies's family, trying to help them understand that their son's service connected him to centuries of military tradition, while preparing him for the challenges of modern warfare. The young guardsman standing motionless outside Buckingham Palace was part of an unbroken chain of service that stretched from ancient battlefields to contemporary peacekeeping missions. Walking through Heathrow Airport, Marcus noticed other travelers in military uniforms from various nations. Each one carried their own stories of service, sacrifice, and dedication to ideals larger than personal comfort or convenience. The connections he had made in London were part of a much larger network of professional relationships and mutual respect that helped maintain stability in an uncertain world. His grandfather's letter had been delivered, not to its original intended recipient, but to people who could understand and appreciate its significance. The circle had been completed in a way that honored both the past and the present, creating new connections while acknowledging old debts. As his plane taxied toward takeoff, Marcus looked out the window at the London skyline, knowing that somewhere in the city, Guardsman Davies was standing at his post, maintaining traditions that connected him to Marcus's grandfather, to Corporal Mitchell, and to countless other soldiers who had served with honor and distinction throughout history. The aircraft lifted off, carrying Marcus home with a deeper understanding of what military service meant, not just as a career or duty, but as participation in something timeless and essential to human civilization. 6 months after returning from London, Marcus sat in his small apartment in Fort Bragg, carefully writing a letter that had taken him weeks to compose. It was addressed to the Davies family in Wales, but its contents had grown far beyond the simple introduction that Guardsman Davies had originally requested. The letter had become Marcus's attempt to explain something that he himself was still coming to understand: the true meaning of military service in the modern world. The apartment around him reflected his own military journey. Photos from Afghanistan shared wall space with his grandfather's wartime memorabilia, including the original letter and photograph that had started his London adventure. A new addition was the Coldstream Guards regimental badge that Major Thompson had given him, now displayed in a place of honor next to his grandfather's Purple Heart. Marcus had maintained regular correspondence with Colonel Mitchell, and their letters had provided ongoing insight into the lives and challenges of the British military personnel he had met. He learned that Guardsman Davies had been promoted to Lance Corporal and was preparing for another deployment, this time to a peacekeeping mission in Cyprus. Captain Hartwell had been selected for advanced command training, recognition of her exceptional leadership during her time with the Queen's Guard. These updates had helped Marcus understand that his London experience was part of an ongoing story, not a concluded chapter. The connections he had made were living relationships that continued to evolve and influence the people involved. Davies had written to thank Marcus for his letter to the family, explaining that it had helped his parents understand why military traditions mattered, and had actually encouraged his younger brother to consider military service. As Marcus worked on his letter, he thought about the changes in his own perspective since returning from London. His grandfather's stories had taken on new meaning, and he found himself paying closer attention to the traditions and ceremonies of his own unit. The precision drills that had once seemed routine now felt like connections to something larger and more enduring. He had also begun mentoring younger soldiers in his unit, sharing not just technical knowledge but insights about the deeper meaning of military service. Many of these soldiers came from backgrounds with little military connection, and they struggled to understand why traditions and ceremonies mattered. When their primary concern was learning practical skills for deployment, Marcus found himself using examples from his London experience to explain these concepts. He told them about Guardsman Davies, a combat veteran who found meaning in ceremonial duties because they connected him to the broader history and purpose of military service. He described the discipline required to stand perfectly still while tourists tried to provoke reactions, and how that same mental discipline served soldiers in combat situations. The response from his mentees had been encouraging. Several had expressed new interest in their unit's ceremonial functions, and one had even requested assignment to the Honor Guard at Arlington National Cemetery. Marcus realized that his grandfather's letter had accomplished something far beyond its original purpose. It had created a ripple effect of understanding and connection that continued to spread. His own military career had also benefited from the London experience. The connections he had made with British officers had led to opportunities for joint training exercises and exchange programs. His commander had noted the maturity and perspective Marcus had gained, and had recommended him for promotion and advanced leadership training. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus's understanding of his own family history. The stories his grandfather had told were no longer just entertaining tales from the past. They were part of a continuous narrative of service that Marcus was now actively writing through his own choices and actions. He had visited his grandfather's grave shortly after returning from London, bringing with him photos from his time at Buckingham Palace and copies of the correspondence with Colonel Mitchell. Standing beside the simple military headstone, Marcus had felt a profound sense of completion and continuity. His grandfather's unfinished business had been resolved, but more importantly, the values and connections it represented were being carried forward. The letter to the Davies family was nearly complete, but Marcus paused to consider one final section. He wanted to explain something that he hadn't fully understood until months after his London visit. That military service was ultimately about creating and maintaining connections between people who might otherwise never meet or understand each other. His grandfather and Corporal Mitchell had been strangers from different countries who found common ground and shared danger and mutual commitment to their duties. Marcus and Guardsman Davies had connected across the same cultural divide, but in peacetime rather than war. Both relationships had been built on recognition of shared values and mutual respect for the challenges of military service. Marcus wrote about how these connections created networks of understanding that extended far beyond individual relationships. When American and British forces worked together in current operations, they built on foundations laid by previous generations of soldiers who had learned to trust and rely on each other. The precision and professionalism that tourists observed outside Buckingham Palace was part of the same military culture that enabled effective cooperation in combat zones around the world. As he sealed the letter and prepared to mail it, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was Captain Hartwell, calling from London with news that seemed almost too coincidental to be real. Guardsman Davies, now Lance Corporal Davies, had been selected to participate in a joint training exercise with American forces at Fort Bragg. He would be arriving in North Carolina within the month. The prospect of reuniting with Davies on Marcus's home ground felt like another chapter in the ongoing story that had begun with his grandfather's letter. Marcus immediately began planning ways to return the hospitality he had received in London, including arranging for Davies to visit local military museums and meet with American soldiers who had served in joint operations. He also planned to introduce Davies to some of the younger soldiers he had been mentoring, knowing that hearing about British military traditions and experiences would broaden their perspectives on military service. The cycle of connection and understanding would continue, with each interaction creating new possibilities for cooperation and friendship. That evening, Marcus called Colonel Mitchell to share the news about Davies's upcoming visit. The elderly officer was delighted, noting that it represented exactly the kind of ongoing military relationship that had been the goal of the original ceremony. He also shared news that a memorial was being planned to honor joint British-American operations during World War II, and that Marcus's grandfather's story would be included in the dedication. As Marcus hung up the phone, he looked once more at the collection of military memorabilia that told the story of 3 generations of service. His grandfather's letter had finally been delivered, but its impact continued to create new connections and understanding. The traditions represented by the Queen's Guard weren't just historical curiosities. They were living links between past, present, and future generations of soldiers who found meaning in service to something larger than themselves. The young guardsman who had stood so perfectly still while a child cried at his feet would soon be standing on American soil, continuing a tradition of international military cooperation that stretched back decades. And somewhere in Wales, a family was learning to understand why their son's service mattered, not just to him but to the broader cause of maintaining peace and stability in an uncertain world.